The Nvidia RTX 2070 and RTX 2080 are both good gaming graphics cards in terms of overall power, but which should you pick, and is it worth upgrading? In this video, we'll test out a bunch of games at 4K, 1440p, and 1080p to help you see the performance difference between them, and find out which is better for the price. Let's quickly take a look at how the RTX 2070 and RTX 2080 actually differ in terms of specs. Note that things like clock speed and power will vary between specific cards. These are just the reference specs for each model. The 2080 has more CUDA cores, higher base and boost clock speeds, so an improvement in most aspects. Although the memory between them is the same. The 2070 also has no NVLink capability, while the 2080 does. For testing, I'm using the Zotac RTX 2070 Mini and the MSI RTX 2080 Ventus OC, so both cards are factory overclocked. However, overclocks generally only equate to a couple of FPS here and there in most games, so expect slightly different results with different cards. The system that I'm testing with has an Intel i7-8700K CPU in an MSI Z390 Gaming Pro Carbon motherboard running at stock speeds, along with 16GB of T-Force Nighthawk CL16 memory from Team Group, running at DDR4 3200 in dual channel. Check the links in the description for details on all of the components, as well as for up-to-date pricing. The same Windows version and Nvidia drivers were used for the testing, so let's get into the results. Assassin's Creed Odyssey was tested with a built-in benchmark using high settings. In all of the upcoming graphs, I've got the RTX 20 results shown by the green bars, and the RTX 2080 shown by the blue bars underneath, with 4K, 1440p, and 1080p resolutions listed on the left. Starting down the bottom at 1080p, there was an 8% improvement in terms of average FPS with the 2080, a slightly higher 9% at 1440p, then 14% higher FPS at 4K. Battlefield 5 was tested in campaign mode rather than multiplayer, as it's easier to consistently reproduce the test run, and it seems to be more graphically intensive, as there were fairly big differences between the two GPUs here. At 1080p, the RTX 2080 was 16% ahead of the RTX 2070 for average frame rate, 23% higher at 1440p, and then 25% higher average FPS at 4K, a fairly significant difference, although at 4K there were no major differences in 1% low. I've also tested Battlefield 5 with RTX on, and overall the results don't look great. Granted, I am playing with high settings here. You could of course use lower settings to boost the frame rate, but in my opinion, the game looks better in higher settings with RTX off and performs better too. At 1080p, it was playable with both the 2070 and 2080, although the 2080 was scoring 22% higher average FPS. At 1440p, I'd say it was still playable, but I think for a first-person shooter game, you generally want to at least target 60 FPS. Anyway, the 2080 saw a 23% improvement here, while at 4K there was a 15% improvement. It's also worth mentioning that at 1440p and 1080p, the 2080 had 1% low results higher than the average of the 2070, a nice improvement. Far Cry 5 was tested using the built-in benchmark with high settings. At 1080p, there was just a 7% improvement to average frame rate with the 2080, but a much larger 26% increase to the 1% low. At 1440p, the 2080 was now seeing 22% higher average FPS, and then a massive 28.5% improvement at 4K, where the 1% low of the 2080 at 4K was almost ahead of the average frame rate from the 2070. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was tested using the built-in benchmark with high settings. At the bottom of the graph, with our 1080p results, the 2080 was getting 15% higher average FPS compared with the 2070. At 1440p, this rises to a 25% improvement with the 2080, and then up to 29% higher average FPS at 4K. Rainbow Six Siege was tested using the built-in benchmark with high settings. I've found this game to favour Nvidia's Turing graphics cards over Pascal, so we're seeing nice performance here overall. In terms of differences though, at 1080p, the 2080 was getting around 11% higher average FPS compared to the 2070, 21% higher at 1440p, and finally a large 30% improvement to 4K, where yet again, the 1% low from the 2080 result was close to the average of the 2070. CSGO was tested with the Uletical FPS benchmark, and at 1080p there was a 7% improvement to average frame rate with the 2080. At 1440p, there wasn't really any change, with now a 6% increase. While at 4K, there was a larger 12% boost to average FPS. Either way, both are still providing extremely good performance. I generally find this to be more of a CPU-bound test anyway, so it's a good example of a game that makes less of a difference which you pick. Overwatch was tested in the practice range, as I can easily perform the same test run compared to playing with bots or other players, which will differ every time. The RTX 2080 only saw a 7% increase to average FPS at 1080p, but then at 1440p this rose to 22%, and then 25% at 4K. At 4K, even the 1% low was higher than the average FPS of the 2070, although the game did still play well even with ultra settings at 4K on either card, as this is a pretty well optimized game. PUBG was tested using the replay feature, with the exact same replay at high settings. At 1080p, the RTX 2080 saw almost no improvement to average FPS, but was a little better in 1% low. At 1440p, there's now more of a difference, with a 17% boost to the average frame rate, and then a larger 26% improvement was seen at 4K. Watch Dogs 2 is a resource-intensive game, and I can play it alright with a solid 30 FPS, so it was actually going well on either card at 4K with very high settings. This was another game where the 1% low of the 2080 was almost ahead of the average FPS the 2070 was able to provide. At 1080p, the average FPS from the 2080 was 11% better compared to the 2070, rising to 21% at 1440p, then 25% at 4K. In terms of overall improvement, with all 10 tests with a 1080p resolution, on average the RTX 2080 is performing 10.6% better than the RTX 2070 in average FPS. More CPU demanding games like CSGO for instance are closer to the bottom, while others like Battlefield 5 seem to really benefit from the increased GPU power. At 1440p, on average over the same games, the RTX 2080 was now scoring 19% higher average frame rates when compared with the RTX 2070. So a nice increase to performance now as we step the resolution up. However, we can see the results still vary a bit depending on the game. At 4K, the RTX 2080 was now on average 23.2% better than the RTX 2070 in these games. The average frame rate difference improves further as we step up in resolution and start becoming less CPU bound, and really start to see what these graphics cards are capable of. As we've seen before, the 2080 is close to a 1080 Ti, so in lieu of the 2080 Ti, it's actually not a bad option for 4K gaming with higher settings. I haven't tested overclocking here, as results aren't guaranteed and will vary between hardware based on what overclocks you can get. Realistically, it generally only makes a couple of FPS difference, but I'll cover overclocking in the full review videos for each of these cards, so get subscribed for that. Now for the final difference, the price. I suggest checking updated prices using the links in the description, as prices will change over time. At the time of recording, the Zotac RTX 2070 Mini I'm testing with goes for around $529 US, while the MSI RTX 2080 Ventus OC is $729, so a $200 price increase, or 37.8% more money to go from the 2070 to 2080. There are of course other priced 2070 and 2080 cards, so you can do the math with my results to work out the difference based on the model you're looking at. I think for lower resolutions like 1080p, the 2080 is less worthwhile, as there was just a 10% average performance gain with the 2080. However, for higher resolutions like 1440p and 4K, the 2080 was giving 19% and 23% higher performance respectively, making it an easier pill to swallow. It does of course depend on the game you're playing though. In some cases like Overwatch, I don't really think it would make a noticeable difference while playing. Whereas with other games, the 2080 can take you to a playable experience at 4K, where the 2070 would be struggling. I think I'd pay more just to get the 2080 if I needed that level of power. But that's only because, as we saw in my recent 2060 vs 2070 video, the 2070 is pretty bad value. The 2060 is much better. So if I was going to be sticking to 1080p and maybe some 1440p, I'd probably be looking there instead. You then of course also have the 10 series cards, which can be picked up on the secondhand market for an even better deal, but that's an entirely different story. Let me know which card you'd pick down in the comments, the 2070 or 2080. And don't forget to subscribe for more comparisons and future tech videos like this one.